The EU and Canada deepening ties following a summit in Brussels.
Sure, Canada and the European Union have signed a new security and defense pact amid growing geopolitical threats and regional instability.
More than 75 billion euros in transatlantic trade quietly shifted away from the United States, not because of a collapse, not because of a crisis, but because Canada built an alternative faster than Washington believed possible. And here is the uncomfortable question facing American policymakers tonight. What happens when a country you once assumed you could pressure quietly builds an escape route so deep, so wide, and so permanent that your leverage simply stops working? Because what Canada did next goes far beyond trade. And by the end of this analysis, the full cost of that miscalculation will become impossible to ignore. Tariffs were supposed to discipline partners. Instead, they trained them to leave. Buy American policies were designed to pull production inward. Instead, they pushed allied supply chains outward, straight into legally protected corridors beyond Washington's reach. From Canada's perspective, the risk calculation became brutally simple. Remaining dependent on a single market that increasingly weaponized trade policy meant accepting permanent uncertainty. Building redundancy through Europe meant absorbing short-term adjustment costs in exchange for long-term security. Ottawa chose security. Under CETA, Canada did not merely redirect exports. It restructured entire industrial flows. Metals, energy inputs, advanced manufacturing components, and high-value agricultural products began moving under treaty protection, shielded from sudden tariffs and political bargaining. Once these flows stabilized, capital followed. European firms expanded Canadian operations. Canadian firms rewired logistics and production standards toward European demand. This is where the severity deepens. Trade war pressure only works when exit costs are high. Canada lowered those costs faster than Washington could react. The United States now faces a structural problem of its own making. American manufacturers that once assumed preferential access to Canadian inputs now compete with European buyers operating under more predictable rules. Price volatility increases. Planning horizons shorten. Supply certainty erodes. These effects do not announce themselves in headlines. They surface quietly in procurement delays, higher consumer prices, and fragile employment in industries tied to cross-border inputs. For Canada, the equation flips. Diversification reduces vulnerability. Treaty-based access converts political risk into contractual stability. In a trade war environment, stability is power. This is no longer a temporary adjustment. Factories do not relocate for political theater. Supply chains do not rewrite themselves for short-term headlines. Once embedded, they lock in behavior for decades. And this is where Washington's blind spot becomes impossible to ignore. Because while the United States focused on pressuring Canada through tariffs, Canada was preparing something far more consequential than trade diversification alone. What came next pulled Canada directly into industrial and security domains that Washington once assumed would always orbit American: leadership. And that next step is where the real shock begins. The most dangerous shift for the United States is not visible on a trade balance sheet. It is happening inside factories, logistics networks, and investment decisions that no longer treat the United States as the default destination. Consider a mid-sized Canadian industrial supplier that once sent most of its output south. Exposure to repeated tariff threats forced a strategic recalculation. Instead of waiting for policy clarity from Washington, the company redesigned its production to comply with European regulatory standards under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. That decision unlocked long-term contracts, stable pricing, and legally protected market access across Europe. The immediate effect was not explosive growth. It was something more powerful: predictability. With predictability came investment. Machinery was upgraded. Skilled labor was retained instead of laid off. Research partnerships expanded with European firms that valued regulatory alignment over political pressure. The company no longer negotiated from fear, it negotiated from options. Multiply this decision across metals, energy inputs, advanced manufacturing, and value-added agriculture, and a systemic transformation emerges. Canada is no longer exporting vulnerability. It is exporting certainty. This is the core mistake Washington underestimated. Trade war pressure does not merely redirect shipments. It reshapes behavior. Once companies adapt to a world where the United States is optional rather than essential, that mental shift does not reverse. And that brings us to the second, far more destabilizing consequence. Because every gain in Canadian stability produces a corresponding loss on the American side of the border. For decades, American industry operated on an assumption that Canadian inputs would always be nearby, reliable, and politically secure. That assumption is now breaking. As Canadian producers anchor supply chains toward Europe, American buyers face tighter availability, shorter planning windows, and rising procurement uncertainty. These pressures do not arrive as dramatic collapses. They arrive as missed delivery targets, delayed capital investment, and cautious hiring decisions. For workers, this translates into something painfully familiar: volatility. When supply chains wobble, overtime disappears before jobs do. When margins compress, benefits are renegotiated before layoffs begin. The human cost surfaces gradually but relentlessly. For consumers, the effect is equally corrosive. Reduced supply certainty pushes prices higher and choice narrower. What once moved seamlessly across the border now competes in a global bidding environment where the United States no longer holds priority access. Meanwhile, Canada absorbs the opposite shock. Diversification cushions downturns. Treaty protection dampens political risk. Industrial planning horizons extend rather than contract. This is not a zero-sum game that the United States can simply renegotiate its way out of. Once alternatives are proven, leverage evaporates. And yet, this economic erosion is still only the outer layer of the story. Because the most consequential shift is not happening in consumer goods or industrial inputs. It is unfolding in sectors that touch national security, strategic autonomy, and the long-term balance of power among allies. And when Canada crossed that threshold, the implications for the United States became far more severe than any tariff dispute. The moment Canada extended its cooperation with Europe beyond commerce, the consequences for the United States became far more serious than any trade war dispute over tariffs. Industrial cooperation evolved into strategic alignment. Canada began positioning itself not only as a supplier of materials, but as a reliable participant in advanced production ecosystems tied to European security, resilience, and long-term industrial sovereignty. This matters because industrial depth determines who controls critical technologies, who sets standards, and who absorbs shocks when global systems fracture. For decades, the United States assumed that Allied industrial capacity would naturally orbit American leadership. That assumption is now under strain. As Canada deepens integration with European partners, it reduces dependence on American approval, American procurement cycles, and American political risk. In a trade war environment, this shift is explosive. Security-aligned supply chains are harder to disrupt, harder to pressure, and far less responsive to tariffs. When production decisions are embedded in multilateral frameworks, unilateral pressure loses effectiveness. This is not a rejection of the United States. It is something more destabilizing. It is a recalibration away from automatic alignment. For Washington, this represents a quiet erosion of influence that cannot be reversed with negotiations alone. Influence once lost through redundancy is rarely recovered. And this realignment does not stop at physical goods, because the next front is even more consequential, and it strikes directly at how economic power is defined in the modern era. Trade wars are no longer fought only over steel, energy, or agriculture. They are fought over rules. As Canada coordinates more closely with Europe on digital trade frameworks, data governance, and regulatory alignment, the United States loses its historic advantage as the primary rule setter among advanced economies. When allies write rules together without Washington at the center, American firms adapt rather than lead. This shift reshapes economic gravity. Standards determine market access. Compliance determines competitiveness. Once those standards harden outside United States influence, tariffs become blunt tools in a system governed by precision. For Canada, shared rulemaking reduces vulnerability. For Europe, it diversifies leadership. For the United States, it creates a strategic dilemma. Pressure accelerates divergence. Restraint risks irrelevance. This is the trade war paradox. Every attempt to assert dominance through tariffs encourages allies to build insulation. Every signal of unpredictability strengthens the case for alternatives. Canada has now crossed a threshold where alternatives are not theoretical. They are operational, and here lies the most dangerous implication of all. When allies learn that resilience comes from distance rather than dependence, the United States does not lose one partner. It loses the expectation of compliance. And what happens next will determine whether Washington adapts to this new reality or continues to tighten pressure in a system where pressure no longer works. Because in the final stage of this story, the costs stop being abstract and start colliding with American workers, voters, and long-term economic security. At this stage, the danger for the United States is no longer miscalculation. It is entrapment. The core assumption behind tariffs in the trade war era was simple. Apply pressure, extract concessions, restore balance. That logic collapses when the targeted partner builds a parallel system that functions without you. Canada has now done exactly that. Once trade flows are locked into treaty-protected corridors, once capital investments are sunk into factories and logistics networks aligned with Europe, once regulatory compliance is redesigned away from United States-centered norms, the cost of reversal becomes prohibitive. No administration, no matter how conciliatory, can simply order companies to unwind these structures. This creates a strategic trap for Washington. If pressure continues, it accelerates diversification. If pressure eases, the leverage that once existed does not automatically return. This is the structural asymmetry Canada has quietly achieved. It can engage the United States when beneficial, disengage when necessary, and absorb shocks without capitulation. The United States, by contrast, faces shrinking room to maneuver as alternatives harden into permanence. In a trade war environment, flexibility is power. Canada gained it. The United States surrendered part of it. And the implications extend beyond bilateral relations. Because once one ally demonstrates that insulation works, others observe, learn, and replicate. The most consequential audience for this shift is not Ottawa or Washington. It is every allied economy watching how power behaves under stress. Canada's experience sends a clear signal. When the United States relies on tariffs as a primary instrument of influence, partners do not necessarily comply. They adapt, they diversify, they redesign their exposure. This changes the global trade war calculus. Power no longer flows solely from market size. It flows from predictability, rule stability, and institutional trust. In those domains, the United States has allowed uncertainty to become a strategic liability. For American workers and consumers, this risk is not abstract. Reduced influence over allied supply chains means less control over prices, availability, and long-term industrial planning. Economic security weakens not through collapse, but through erosion. Canada's gain is not America's immediate loss. But over time, accumulated insulation translates into diminished leverage. And diminished leverage reshapes outcomes in negotiations that once favored Washington by default. This is the quiet shock unfolding beneath the headlines. And it leads to a final question that policymakers can no longer postpone. The most dangerous outcome for the United States is not that Canada strengthened ties with Europe. It is that this shift exposed a deeper truth about power in the modern trade war. Power no longer belongs automatically to the largest market. It belongs to the system that offers certainty when others offer pressure. Canada did not defeat the United States through confrontation. It did something far more effective. It reduced exposure. It replaced dependence with options. It turned a trade agreement into an industrial insurance policy that shields its economy from volatility created elsewhere. For Washington, this is the moment where familiar tools stop delivering familiar results. Tariffs once signaled strength. Now they increasingly signal risk. Pressure once produced compliance. Now it accelerates insulation. This does not mean the United States is weak, but it does mean that leverage is no longer guaranteed, even over close partners. When allies can diversify fast enough, deep enough, and under treaty protection, economic coercion loses its edge. For American workers, the stakes are real. Less influence over allied supply chains means less stability in pricing, planning, and employment. For consumers, it means higher volatility. For policymakers, it means fewer options that do not carry unintended consequences. Canada's strategy forces a hard question that cannot be avoided. Is this moment a warning that the United States must rethink how it exercises economic power in a trade war world? Or is it the beginning of a cycle where pressure continues, alternatives harden, and influence steadily erodes? Because one thing is now clear. The era when allies absorbed uncertainty so the United States could maintain leverage is ending. And what replaces it will define global trade, alliance, politics, and economic security for years to come. The shock is not that Canada found another path. The shock is that it worked. And if it worked once, others are already watching. Is this a bold strategy or a costly mistake for the United States? Subscribe for more fact-based global analysis on trade, power, and the decisions that shape the world economy.